Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 532. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. You ready to do this?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back. I am very excited to have as my guest, Megan MacCutcheon. Megan, welcome.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. So Megan is a licensed professional counselor and certified perinatal mental health practitioner in private practice in Northern Virginia. She specializes in working with women who are experiencing mood and anxiety disorders during pregnancy and following childbirth. She's also passionate about helping victims of trauma and abuse, is trained in EMDR, and enjoys helping adolescents and adults to achieve better quality of life, decrease depression, and manage anxiety by improving self-esteem. Megan has published 4 books on the topics of self-esteem. 4?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Busy. Welcome.
Yes. Thank you.
All right.
Yes.
Before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're currently from.
Yep. So they're one and the same. So I'm actually grew up in Northern Virginia in Vienna, and after going away to college, actually ended up back here. So I have my private practice in the same town that I grew up in.
Nice. Wow.
Yes.
Very interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So let's start. I did have stopped asking people about quotes, but want to ask you about quotes because I know you have some or quote. What do you have for us?
Yeah. So as I said to you when we first were in touch, like one of the things I loved about your podcast, I was always listening to other people's quotes, and the 2 that I really resonate with for trauma work were just always on the forefront of my mind. So I really wanted to share them. And I can't believe people haven't said these yet, at least as far as I've heard in all the episodes. So the first one is Maya Angelou's, "You do the best you can until you know better. When you know better, do better." And I have this on the wall in my office. And I love this because I think it applies so much in trauma. So many people that we're working with, have, in order to cope with their trauma, have developed these coping mechanisms that, aren't the best in their present day, but in their past was what really got them through, dissociation and things like that. And so we always look at, these are things that helped you.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know that they're not, and we can change it. And then the flip side to that, I think working with people who have been through trauma, a lot of times we're looking at things like, well, you didn't grow up in the most nurturing environment, or, maybe your caretakers had some flaws. And it's like, I always use this quote in that context of, it's not to blame what happened, on any of the people that may or may not have protected you, but, they were likely doing the best that they could. And generational trauma had probably made them not be the best that they could be at the time. So I think it gives a really nice frame around, trauma happens, and it's not really about blame or self-blame for what you did or didn't do, but just knowing that it's something we can work through and change from.
Right. Yeah. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Do you have another one?
Yeah. And then the other one I'll share is Viktor Frankl. And he says, and let me first kind of preface this by, so much when I work with trauma, I have people that come in and they'll say, well, this is what happened to me, but I don't really know if it's trauma, or I feel badly for feeling badly about it because there's so much worse in the world. I mean, there's people, in third world countries and this and that's happening. And I love this quote because it gives, it sort of just sheds light on, it doesn't really matter the size of the suffering. So he says, "A man's suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative." So I think that really just helps people recognize, let's not get caught up in the are you worthy of healing? Are you worthy of considering this a trauma? Let's just consider it was for you, and let's try and heal from it.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I love both of those. And the latter one, honoring our own experience. Yeah, I mean, it made me think when I first started this podcast, I thought to myself, oh my God, I haven't suffered this crazy trauma. I was bullied, but many other
Right.
people have suffered. Right. You can't get into that.
Yeah.
It does a disservice. So, all right. Thanks for sharing those. How the heck did you get into this field?
Yeah. So, that's a journey. So I guess I was always interested in psychology. I think like back in undergrad, I really wanted to study. I minored in psychology, but I had an advisor at the time who told me like, oh, you can't do anything with a bachelor's. So do something else. So I did. And I studied communication, got out of school, graduated, and was working in that field for a while, but just was always drawn back to the psych field. Anything that I saw, on TV, like Oprah shows or anything that had to do with the psych field, I was just really drawn to. And so at one point, I started volunteering at a community agency in my town, and then ended up applying to grad school and just, loved it, and did my internship, residency, and then eventually went into private practice. So I think I was just always compelled to do it. And, the trauma work sort of fell into my lap. It was just what I was getting. When I was doing my internship, I was working at a community agency that, worked on a sliding scale, and just so many of the cases that what we're getting were trauma. I mean, one of my very first clients was, full on dissociative identity disorder. And so that really sort of threw me into the trenches, and I was really forced to learn as much as I could about trauma, and to just, back at the time, I know this has been talked about so much on the show, but there's not a lot of great trauma training back, in grad school programs back then. So I was really doing a lot on my own, and just, it's getting better now, but I just always just felt really drawn. I really loved that work. I really loved seeing people. I think that's how I got into the self-esteem work too. Most people that have trauma have some level of wounds to their self-esteem, and just, how great it is that you can help them improve that, and help them see that they can rise above whatever happened to them and feel good about themselves in the end.
Yeah. You said early on you were kind of always attracted to the psychology piece. What about that, if you can put that into words?
I really distinctly remember an episode I saw on Oprah of Harville Hendrix, the imago therapy couples therapist, talking on there. And that's what I initially thought I wanted to do, was couples work. And now I really just love working with individuals. But I think just seeing how people can unpack the things that have happened to them, and unpack their histories, and, what they've gone through, and just go from, maybe an okay life, or maybe a really challenging life, to a life that's so much more fulfilling, and they can find so much more happiness. So I loved the idea that you could help people walk through that process.
And how did the perinatal interest, how did that unfold?
So that really unfolded out of my own personal experience. So I have 3 kids. They're now 7, 5, and 3. And when I had the first one, I was thrilled to be a mom. I do think in hindsight, I had some perinatal stuff coming up. I remember really distinctly this one moment where I was just like in a room by myself researching postpartum depression, because I felt really irritable. I just felt like I just don't feel like myself. I feel like my patience with other people is really low. But I'd only ever heard of postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. So I was Googling, and I was like, I'm not sad. I'm connecting fine with my baby. So I must just be fine. So I ignored it. Then my second baby came along, and with him, I discovered that there is such thing as postpartum anxiety. So after he was born, a few weeks in, the problem was it didn't start till probably between 7 and 10 weeks. And I don't know how familiar you are, but normally moms get their 6-week checkup, where at their OBGYN, they get that, usually it's the Eidenberg postpartum depression scale, to rule out the depression piece. But right now we don't have a real great scale in our culture for also measuring the anxiety piece. So, I tested fine on there. I wasn't sad, I wasn't crying, I could still see the humor in life. But I just felt irritable, I felt confused, I had a lot of brain fog. I had this experience where we had a parent teacher conference with my daughter's teacher, and I think it was at 9:00 a.m. and it was going to last for 20 minutes. I showed up at 9:20 and was like so confused by how I made that error, and then so confused about what to do about it. The teacher said, well, I'm free at 10, so if you want to stick around. And I remember going into the parking lot and just feeling completely overwhelmed. My husband was there. We had two cars. I was like, should we sit in our cars? Should we go somewhere? Should we take two cars? Should we take one car? And he was like, what is wrong with you? Why are these simple decision-making processes so overwhelming? But I really chalked it up at the time to, it's just the transition of parenting two kids versus one. It's just the stress of, having a toddler and a newborn. So I ignored it again for a little while.
Which would be easy to accept. I mean, I have two kids, so I'm thinking,
right.
Yeah.
It's busy, right? It's a busy time. And then there was a day, there was a couple other things too. Like I was hyper focused on like bizarre stuff. Like I remember this day, my baby was crying and I was so irritated because I just wanted to finish organizing the spices in my kitchen cabinet. Like that seemed so important to me. So I was hyper focused on like being productive. I couldn't sit still. And then, again, kept dismissing that. And then came the day where my kids were both crying and I went into a room alone and I remember just crying. And the thoughts that popped into my head were, would I feel better if I slit my wrists or if I threw my baby down the staircase? And then my alarm bells went off. I'm like, okay, I know enough to know that that is a postpartum. When you start having that self-harm, harming the baby, of course, it was nothing in either direction that I was going to act on, which I think is so important. And one message that I want to give to any moms that are listening, I think moms are so scared to admit they have any of these self-harm thoughts. This is not postpartum psychosis. It's not the stuff that we hear about sensationalized in, some of the really terrible and unfortunate news stories that do happen. This is a postpartum anxiety disorder. There's also postpartum OCD, where you have these intrusive thoughts around, harm, inflicting harm or harm happening. So I knew that that was a red flag. And so I went to my OBGYN and she was so sweet. She really normalized it for me and said, when I had a baby, I had thoughts of throwing my baby into a pot of chili. And it was really sweet because she, that just gave me a sigh of release. I know of relief. I know it's sort of shocking to hear some of these things, but the point is these things are really common. And I think, moms really need to know not to be afraid of them. These aren't things that your baby will be taken away for, but they're things that are really treatable, and getting help is what's really important. So at that point I got on medication, started feeling better pretty quickly, stayed on it for a period of time. And now, I'm doing much better. Mm-hmm. So this is really a temporary thing, but because I had waited so long and didn't even know that this existed, I was like, I had been a therapist for, 10 years and had no idea that there was such thing as postpartum anxiety. That's what really got me interested.
The postpartum, what does that define? What length of time does that define?
Yeah. So, it's frustrating because there's not really a great answer. I mean, even the DSM-5 doesn't have a great way of describing this. There are some specifiers in DSM-5 around, depression with perinatal onset. But basically, we consider it, we call it perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. So that is any time during pregnancy or following. Most people will say up to a year following, but there are some studies out there that say the greatest rate of depression is, I can't remember, it's 3 or 4, but around, the toddler age for moms. And so, it's really hard to say. I think there's so many moms that don't get treatment in that first year. So it probably just builds upon itself. Right. But typically we're looking at, during pregnancy up to a year. If you're experiencing something beyond that, it's not to say, oh no, you don't have this anymore. It's probably probably something that was untreated and still absolutely worth going and getting some help for.
Okay. So you said you'd been working for 10 years before you even started learning
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And did this become
Yeah.
something that you kind of folded into your practice?
Yeah, definitely. I became, pretty angry. Like, why don't people know about this? I mean, this is a big deal. And, so postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, those are the two that most people have heard of. But there's also postpartum anxiety, postpartum panic disorder, postpartum OCD, and then postpartum PTSD, which is, anyone that had some sort of trauma during pregnancy or, during the birthing experience. There's so many moms that I've worked with who have had traumatic birthing experiences for one reason or another. Either they, ended up with a birth they weren't planning for, or something went wrong, they hemorrhaged, the baby wasn't okay, had to go into the NICU. And those are things that really contribute to mom's mental health issues and that are super treatable. I've worked a lot, I said I use EMDR, and that's something that can help these moms process out those birth traumas pretty quickly if they know to get that kind of help.
Can you kind of get a little more specific and talk about how you work with moms? Who comes to you? How do they come to you?
Yeah. So I did my training through Postpartum Support International, and I can give you the link to link in the show notes there. It's a great resource. They have amazing trainings, and they have a provider directory, international provider directory. So a lot of times I get referrals through there, moms that make their way onto that website. The state of Virginia, we have a really good postpartum website for moms. So usually it's through those resources or just through word of mouth through some of the other providers that I partner with. And when a mom first comes in, usually she just says, I'm struggling. I don't know what I'm experiencing. I Googled and I found this website and I found your name. Or, my OBGYN told me to reach out, or, whatever pediatrician they're working with, who hopefully, is aware of all of these different disorders. And a lot of times moms will come in for the first couple sessions. It's a little different than some of the clients that I work with who tend to be like weekly, more long-term clients. A lot of times moms will come in a few sessions and, we'll normalize what they're going through. I'll explain to them these different diagnoses and what I think that they're facing. For some, if medication seems like it might be a good option, I'll refer them to a reproductive psychiatrist who I work closely with. And from there, they usually start feeling better relatively quickly. And then some of these moms, we sort of move to like more of an as needed. I have a lot of moms that will do like a once a month sort of check-in. They're feeling a lot better, fairly quickly, but they just kind of want to have a place to check in and to just have somebody kind of making sure they're on that right path. So like I said, very treatable.
Yeah. I would imagine there's a lot of shame, people coming, saying, having these thoughts and feelings and being ashamed of, my God, I don't want to do that to my baby, but yet I feel like,
Yeah. And I can tell you a little bit about one example of a client who found her way to me after having a hospitalization. She had been having these scary thoughts and was terrified by them and went to the ER. And unfortunately, our world just isn't up to date. Like the providers out there just don't know that, like, not everyone is well trained in these disorders. So she ended up being admitted inpatient in the psych unit and had, I can't remember, the diagnosis was something like postpartum depression with major depressive disorder with postpartum onset and OCD personality disorder. And there was some other like bipolar or something in there. And that's not what she was facing. She was a very classic postpartum OCD case where she was having these intrusive thoughts. And the hospitalization was really traumatic for her because she was put on this unit with a lot of people who were, who were psychotic, who were suicidal. And that really wasn't her. She was having these intrusive thoughts, but really, high functioning otherwise. And as soon as we normalized that and, got her to recognize these are just thoughts, they're not things you're going to act on. This is different than psychosis. If you're in a psychotic state, you don't know that those thoughts are scary. They are things that are not disturbing to you because you think they're so real. That's more the type of thoughts like, I have to kill my baby because they're going to be safer in heaven rather than on earth, or, they're possessed by a devil. The thoughts of what if I drop my baby down the staircase, or, what if I accidentally hurt my baby? A lot of times it's sexual in nature too. A lot of moms will have these thoughts popping into their head of like, what if I sexually abuse this child, or what if somebody else does? And they're horrified by that. And they really don't want to admit it because to them it sounds so bizarre. And it is something that for most people that they've never experienced. A lot of times this onset is postpartum, and we don't know exactly why it happens, but we know that it's way more common. The statistics are approximately 1 in 6 women, either during pregnancy or following pregnancy. So it's a pretty high statistic.
I can't say I'm surprised. I mean, obviously, as a dad, it's crazy making having kids, and I can imagine what it would be like for a mom.
Yeah.
So, and I think just normalizing this whole experience goes a really long way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the more people, hopefully people will listen to this and some more people will be aware who weren't, because I think the more we have awareness, the less trauma people will have. Like this one case, she didn't need to be admitted to the hospital. She really just needed to work with somebody who knew what they were dealing with. And then she got on medication that really decreased those thoughts. But the hospitalization in itself added this other layer of trauma that we really then needed to work through.
All right. So let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Megan MacCutcheon. Her website is meganmccutcheon.com. I'll have it linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So how do these books come about? 4 books, that's
so these books came about. So the first one was actually a project that I had to do in my it was during my internship year. We had to do a program plan implementing something that we saw there to be a need for in our site where we were working. And like I said, I was working with a lot of trauma victims, and I was seeing just across the board, whether it was, there was a big domestic violence unit. So whether they were somebody in a domestic violence situation, or somebody who had had a sexual abuse, or someone who just had bullying in their past, or a family that just wasn't as supportive. So that like whole gamut of trauma, what really was in common with all of these people was they really struggled with self-esteem and this idea of sort of who I am. So I decided that my program project was going to be implementing a self-esteem workshop. And so I put together all these resources and came up with this like 5-week workshop. And then when I graduated, I was like, why don't I actually run it? I need to get all these hours towards licensure. So I started running it for a couple of years, and I was just gaining more and more and more information that I wanted to put into this. So I was coming to these workshops with these like stacks of handouts to give to people. And, it was a nonprofit. The copy machine wasn't great. It was always getting jammed. So I finally came up with the idea with, why don't I just like self-publish this into some sort of a manual that people can get with the workshop? So that's how I did the first one. And then a little bit later, I was writing blog articles for goodtherapy.org. And I think through that, I got found by a publisher who they have a really interesting format. What they do is they do some research based on what people really are searching for on Amazon. And then they go out and find experts in the field to write the content to match the need. So they contacted me, and I did a building self-esteem for women workbook with them. And then later they hired me to do 2 specifically for teens. So that's how those came about. And they were really fun to do. I like writing.
Cool. What is it about trauma that impacts someone's self-esteem? Because I can tell you, having been bullied as a kid, my self-esteem was jacked up.
Well, one of the things I talk a lot about in some of the workshops I do is this idea that, when we're born into the world with like this inherent, self-worth. I have this great picture I love of my baby where she's like this chubby, naked baby in the mirror, just like giggling and laughing at herself and just like loving her reflection. Like how many of us as adults, like can say that we have that same reaction when we look in the mirror. Like, not many, because I think as we grow, we start make comparisons of ourselves to others. We start fearing judgment. We stop seeing ourselves as just, sort of this egocentric person, and we start really seeing ourselves as, in relationships to others, we worry about what others people are thinking. We just start getting in our head with that self-talk. I do a lot around teaching like cognitive behavioral therapy around changing your negative self-talk. So I think that as we grow up, we just interpret things as, well, because they're mean to me, maybe it's about me. We don't see that side of, well, this guy's just a jerk. We don't have that maturity and that wisdom to see objectively when we're younger. And so we take it and we internalize it, and we really take it personally until we wind up in some sort of self-help, therapy or program where we can learn to see it differently.
Yeah, it's so powerful how just integrated into one's psyche and soul and being that it goes,
Yeah.
Man.
And a lot of people carry that with them. I mean, for decades.
Yes. Yeah. Hello.
Yeah.
It's true. It's so crazy true. And it's not easy to extricate yourself from. What did you find in doing these groups? What helped people? What worked for them?
Yeah, I think one, normalizing, like, you're not crazy for having these feelings. It's so common for all of us to have these thought processes that really keep us in sort of a down position, like the black and white thinking, the, magnifying all of our weaknesses and dismissing all of our strengths, things like that. So people, have generally really benefited from this idea of really catching their inner critic and starting to take a look at that, starting to shift that. And then I think also, especially people who have been through trauma, just having somebody be able to reflect back to them, like, wow, those people that bullied you or that person that abused you, they sucked. Like, they were not cool people. They were, they were the abusers. It was their fault. Like, this was not your fault. And and I always say to people, it's really awful that what happened to you wasn't your fault, but it's still your responsibility to fix it. It's still your responsibility to build yourself back up from it.
Yeah, good distinction there. All right, let's talk about an early clinical error.
Okay. Well, I think the early clinical errors that I had were just, being new in the field. And like I said, not having a great trauma training background initially. I really thought what people thought like decades ago, that the way you treat trauma is to just like tell your story over and over and over again. And of course, we now know that that's not true, and that actually can be re-triggering and re-traumatizing. So, I wish there's like a handful of clients I remember so distinctively. And I really wish, I hope that they found their way into somebody with the trauma training. Like, I wish I could have given them at that time. So I think that was one of my early ones. And then more recently, I had an experience where somebody contacted me, and I knew she was going to be interviewing a few different therapists, and she had a trauma history. And I really rushed it, and I really regret that. It was during a week where I was really busy, like my caseload. I mean, as most people during COVID, it's just been so busy managing kids and their schedules, and my client load was really full. But she was a referral from a colleague. And whenever I have a referral from a colleague and it's trauma-based, it's like my heart just goes out. I want to help. So we ended up scheduling a 30-minute consult just to kind of see, if we would be a good fit and whatnot. And that was just a bad idea. Like, that didn't, I should have either referred her out because I didn't really have the availability, or we should have worked harder to find a time where we could have spent more time, because you just can't unpack a trauma history in that amount of time. So that was something, even more recently, I recognized as, something I wish I would have done differently. I think we need to take our time with trauma. And, so many people on your podcast have talked about self-care, but the piece that really came up for me in that moment is not taking on people when you don't feel you really have the capacity and the resources to give them, the best help.
Even though you wanted to help out this friend of yours, this colleague of yours. Yeah.
Wow. Of course.
All
right.
All right. So as we wind down here, let me ask you about any go-to book recommendations, whether perinatal related or not, or trauma related or not.
Yeah.
What do you have for us?
of course, I know everyone says this, but I just have to say it too, is the body keeps the score. I think the body keeps the score is so important with this population in particular, because so much can happen physically in the body during pregnancy and during childbirth. And I even was recently hearing some research on babies being born. A lot of times if babies have, colic or just, are really fussy or difficulty sleeping, a lot of times it's because the birth was traumatic, or they were in a really uncomfortable position during birth. And it's just a matter of taking them to a specialist, like a child chiropractic specialist, who can help work that trauma out of the body. So I think this is a great book for that population, to know that that trauma is stored at a physical level, and we really need to get that out. Then the other one I actually have right here is Therapy and the Postpartum Woman by Karen Kleinman.
Oh, okay.
And this one is great for just for therapists to understand more about what can happen during the perinatal period, and knowing that, even if you're a clinician who's been in practice for decades and decades, if you don't have this specialized knowledge and specialized training, you may be doing more harm to some of the moms that you're working with. It's something that we really need to have on our radar and really know about. So that's a great book to start with. And then, of course, I mentioned Postpartum Support International, a great website with lots of resources and local resources.
Okay, so Postpartum Support International, I'll have that along with those books listed at the podcast page. It's traumatherapistpodcast.com. All right, Megan, thank you so much for coming on here. I really appreciate you sharing your experience and just opening up. A lot of people are going to be listening to this and thinking, oh my gosh, I need that piece, that perinatal piece and understanding. I think it's crucial.
Absolutely. Yeah. So many moms I talk to, that when they hear what I do, they're like, oh my gosh, I think I had that. I had no idea it was a thing. And I suffered and I struggled through it. And it is so treatable. It is such a treatable thing. So get help if you at all are questioning it, for sure.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.